So we'll have two venues because of the capacity of the room. So participants following online and also participants following downstairs will also be having opportunity to use question and discussions, and my colleague will take them. So to interact with the speaker. All right? Yeah. Okay. So let's start. So I will chair the session. My name is Renfiong Hu. I work as a senior legal and policy advisor with Medicine Sans Frontiers Access Campaign based in Geneva. So it's my honor to introduce a very impressive line of speakers who have agreed to share their time and experiences with us. So from that end is Dr. Maria Guevara. So she works as an international medical secretarial for MSF International. So basically, she supports of medical issues in MSF. And then to her right-hand side is Dr. Armand Günther. So Armand has been working on Ebola response among many other emergency response with MSF team in different countries for more than 20 years. So he's a specialist on those issues. So we're very happy to have him with us. And then we have honored to welcome Dr. Precious Matsoso. So as you already know, and Precious is now leading a very critical process internationally as a co-chair of international negotiation body under WHO. So previously, we also know Precious has served in very different roles, leading global health issues both in South Africa and in WHO. So very honored to have Precious with us. And then we have my colleague, Julian Putte. So he worked as a senior advisor for tropical neglected diseases for his access campaign of MSF. So who is one of the main authors of the report that we are launching today. And then lastly, we have honored to welcome Namalia Siang, who is the senior program officer and expert on intellectual property development and health issues with the South Center, which is an intergovernmental organization mostly working with developing countries. So thank you very much for all of the speakers joining us today. And in the room, we also have a mixed delegation from international organizations, permanent missions, and civil society organizations. For instance, we have the global health ambassador from the government of France, Ambassador Anne-Put, very welcome and she's with us in the room. She also will share the experiences from member states' perspective on the Great.
Just one more ground announcement. The mics that we're using are actually in the room, so even if people whisper, people online are able to listen. So sorry.
So it's also new for me without the mobile mic, but mic is one seems function very well. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna open the event by inviting Dr. Maria to give us opening welcome.
Yes, thank you, Ewan. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our new MSF office. It's our new eco-conscious building, well lit, obviously with great microphones. But thank you for coming and showing your interest on this very important topic of equity and fairness, the Ebola case. We're taking this opportunity, as already mentioned, to launch the report ensuring access to new Ebola treatments. But it's always challenging to start a discussion just after lunch, because we know that food coma can set in even in the best intention. But luckily, the topic is that interesting that it should keep you on the edge of your seat and hopefully ready to join us in the call to convert or to corrective action. But as I open this this project or this, I'm always thinking about projects. This event, I just wanted to, if you don't mind, let me take a little mini health poll. So I'd like to see a show of hands who here have ever gotten COVID. Right, wow, okay, and how many actually got it before vaccine? Okay, that's at least it's not so many, but how many actually have access to vaccines? Great. great to see. So yes, we're the lucky ones. And I also got COVID, but only once last year, after even a full vaccine series. But I was comfortable because I knew that there was some possible treatments and there was a vaccines that at least give me some immune protection, some immunity, and that I would be able to ride it through. And that this newly minted vaccines that came out in unprecedented speed was there to protect me. But it also showed that the R&D was working. Unfortunately, the speed was not relayed out to all the people who actually needed it in the most acute moments. So we know that these lifesavers were not reaching those that do not have. So basically, they were kept in the hands of the haves and not in the hands of the have-nots. So, but before COVID, there was always Ebola, and it still is Ebola. And it was discovered in 1976. Yet, even in the last 2 years, we had no access to vaccines and no treatments. So what do we do now with these possible great change or treatments that we've seen today, or we're going to present today? So why was that the case? 40 years ago, 40 years later, since its discovery in 2014, I'll bring you back to the scene of West Africa in Guinea, at the border with Liberia and Sierra Leone. MSF received a call from the Ministry of Health of Guinea about a mysterious disease that caused the death of a number of health staff. It was Ebola, but it was West Africa. Unheard of, but not impossible. And the world didn't believe that it would spread like wildfire, but it did, and it spilled too easily in the neighboring countries and even overseas. So at the time, we said the virus cut a fast swath through the 3 countries, and a cross-border geographical spread never seen before. Fear and panic set in. The sick and their families were desperate. National health workers and MSF teams alike were overwhelmed and exhausted, and medical workers were not trained to deal with at least 50% of their patients dying from a disease for which no treatments existed. This was an excerpt from an MSF report published in 2015 called Push to the Limit and Beyond, a year into the largest ever Ebola outbreak. It might as well have been describing this COVID situation that we faced. But why are these treatments not available still despite 40 years since its discovery? There was research, but it was around bioterrorism, focused on security concerns, and not of saving the lives of those who faced cycles of local Ebola outbreaks throughout those decades. And the era of human security with health security became a new brand of security threats. 10 years prior to the 2014 outbreak, a vaccine was in fact already developed, but because there was no market in the developed world, further research was stalled. So you fast forward 4 years later from 2014, the longest run of an Ebola outbreak was then raging through North Kivu in the Ituri in the northeast region of Democratic Republic of Congo in the middle of a conflict zone. And this time, however, there were vaccines and treatments available, albeit in testing phases. So I was one of those emergency medical coordinators deployed in the DRC at that time in October 2018, early days. And we had an Ebola treatment center in Butembo before it was attacked and burnt down. It was packed with patients. And this time, they were actually involved in the PALM trial. The PALM is short for Pamoja Tuleni Match. It's Kiswahili for Together Saves Lives, which was testing 4 treatment options. And our medical teams with the Ministry of Health staff, can you hear me now? It's not working so well. With the Ministry of Health staff, we're having weekly meetings actually with the DRC's National Institute for Biomedical Research. 4 years since that time, WHO launched the EBD treatment guidelines with strong recommendations for the use of 2 of the 4 of those treatment options provided. So despite this, however, only 34% of patients who acquired Ebola in the last 5 outbreaks have received it. So why is this still the case? And where is the duty to benefit sharing? Why are recommended medicines still far from being used? to their full potential in outbreak response. Medicine shouldn't be a luxury, but rather global public goods. So as we gather here at the sidelines of the 76th World Health Assembly, and as member states and global health community deliberate on what a new pandemic accord should look like, are we really learning those lessons? Are we doing any better for the outbreaks already at hand? Well, I'll leave it for you to judge for yourselves as we listen to the expert advice from our panelists today. And I will end there as we listen together.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, for this already provocative opening. So hopefully we will stimulate our discussion going forward in the event. So now I'd like to also I was requested to remind our speaker to speak up for this new technology in the room, for the sake of the room here. Okay, so now I would like to invite Armand, because Armand, you've been working on these issues and in the field of with MSF team for more than 20 years. So what it was like as a medical doctor when there was no treatment? Can you tell us your hands-on experience? There was no, right tool for you to use.
I think Maria kind of covered it. A consistent theme early on, pre-2018, was a feeling of clinical impotence among the clinicians. Day after day, seeing patients for whom you could provide some supportive care, some symptomatic relief, die anyway. A large portion of them, usually more than half, day after day, no matter what you did. This takes a toll on the clinicians and the nurses alike. You have to go and tell the families that their loved one had died day after day. And it was one of frustration and sadness that people who had come from around the world to do their best to work in an outbreak were so powerless. And it also had a bad effect on the patients, because clinicians who, when everything they try doesn't work, they start reaching for things. They start thinking, well, maybe given how bad this is, I should try something. And they would reach for steroids, or they would reach for different kinds of antibiotics, or they would reach for blood transfusions. They would do anything that they could rationalize. And if there's something we learned from the COVID outbreak, it is that when people think nothing seems to work, I should try what I can, we often do more harm than good. So I think we were frustrated, saddened, and often practicing bad medicine along with good medicine. And I think that it's difficult when you're a medical organization, when you are focusing on the patient, you're unable to do anything for the patient, and everything you try doesn't work. It makes it very difficult for the individuals. And also for the organization, because we're not just there for the patients, we're there also to work on the outbreak. Because if you want to save patients, the best way to not have patients is to stop the outbreak so you don't have more patients. And if I can oversimplify how you control an Ebola outbreak, you find people who are shedding the virus, and you bring them to some place where shedding the virus will not infect other people. And that's the treatment unit. And you've got two ways to get them there: coercion or persuasion. And coercion isn't our way, and it's counterproductive, because if you start forcing people into the treatment unit, you're suddenly going to have a very hard time finding sick people, and the community is going to turn against you. So it's a bad idea for a lot of reasons. So you've got persuasion. And if the treatment unit is not producing a lot of survivors, these patients are not dummies. They're going to do a cost-benefit analysis. They say, what's in it for me? Maybe there's a marginally improved chance that I survive, but this means I'm taken away from my family and loved ones. I'm put into a strange place where I'm all alone, and I may be dying all by myself. And unsurprisingly, we did not have a great marketing hook for the treatment unit. And as a result, outbreak control suffers. So when the effective treatments came along, we thought, this is a game changer. This means not only can I do something for my patient. And so we could at last do something for the patients, which was in and of itself great, but it also meant we had a reason to bring people into the treatment unit. These people who understand these things would come to us. They would no longer infect other people. We could control outbreaks. We thought this is going to mean everything. Unfortunately, there are two assumptions here that are a bit shaky. One is that the community is going to trust that you are acting in their best interest and that what you are doing for them is going to make things better. And the second one is that there will actually be treatments there in sufficient quantities that you can do what you set out to do. And we are here today because the second assumption is not holding as well as we would like, and that has knockdown effects on the first assumption and outbreak control kind of stuff. So that's kind of where we are. And I mean, I would like to acknowledge that we have what we have today because of a biodefense imperative in the United States, and that's fine, right? You know, without it, we probably have nothing. But we have to remember the same biodefense imperative that gave us these medicines also determined the quantities in which they would be made and their disposition, which is in U.S. strategic stockpiles. Their availability as treatments for our patients is a secondary intent, which is nice to have and it's welcome, but it's kind of a distraction from the primary. So it's like you're walking a tightrope and the person underneath you in charge of the safety net is busy checking their iPhone and scrolling Instagram. You really want to have their undivided attention, right? We want these things to be there first and foremost for the patients, and they're not. And so here we are trying to decide what we're going to do about it.
Thank you so much, Aman. So this brings back, I mean, the purpose of us sharing this report to everyone is that we want to tell a story that is a human story. You know, what's the deficiency of governance on R&D and access is managed actually have concrete, real-life impact on individual doctors and patients we are working with. So without that, but we also need to move this story into the policy space and to see how do we summarize what we learned? What do we think? You know, things need to change, action need to take it. That's bringing to Julian, who work on these issues a lot. So as we said, we're launching a new report today, so everyone have the summary of the report, and there's a QR code. The report is online, so welcome to look at the full report. But in that report, we have some summary of the ongoing challenges. So maybe Julian, you can tell us in the summary, like what are the key issues that from the work from medical team, policy team, and other teams. What's going on now in the ongoing challenges? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, in our report, we try to meticulously describe the history of the development of these two treatments against Ebola and their deployment and distribution. So it's a relatively long and scrutiny and process. And I'll try to describe a little bit the main findings. So in our report, sorry.
Yeah.
To speak up,
Yeah.
I'll try to shout.
Yeah.
So we demonstrate that the development of these two therapeutics was overwhelmingly, with no surprise, it was overwhelmingly supported by the not-for-profit sector. Primarily, like Armand was saying, by public funding from the US government for biodefense reasons, but also, and we should not forget that, there were a lot of in-kind contributions by other actors, including the patients first, of course, but also some responders in the field, like MSF, like other NGOs, Ministries of Health of DRC, Guinea, just to cite a few, and the WHO. There was a good coalition of the willing to implement the studies that demonstrated the effectiveness of these treatments, and these studies were not so simple, as you can imagine, to implement. But the main message here is that the contributions were primarily by the not-for-profit sector. If you look at the contributions by the pharmaceutical companies that currently hold the licenses, and there are two companies, one is Regeneron, the other is a tiny company called Ridgeback. Their contributions have been, as best, very limited in the case of Regeneron, and in the case of Ridgeback, the other company, it's been non-existent. They haven't contributed to research and development. So basically, these products stem from efforts by the not-for-profit sector as a whole. That's an important point to make and to remember. And then in our report, we look at the situation with regards to access to treatment now, to the current situation, almost 4 years after the completion of the PALM study. So it's been quite a long time. And unfortunately, the situation is far from perfect. Sorry. Less than 100 treatment courses are currently available in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is not much, And as far as we are aware, there are no other doses currently available in Africa. So if we look at the African continent, including all the countries at highest risk, maximum 100 treatment courses. WHO is trying to procure some more doses, but the negotiations and discussions with the companies are taking a long time. One of the reasons being that these treatments, at least in the case of Regeneron, we know that the price is probably going to be quite high. So there is a need to discuss a lot to get a good price and an affordable product. On its end, the US government has put a lot of money on the table in order to establish its own domestic stockpile of treatments. And we know that the US government, that's a different thing, the US government is now procuring tens of thousands of doses of these treatments. And then the doses can be sent to Africa on a piecemeal basis when an outbreak emerges, when an outbreak occurs. But we believe that this system is not very fair, first, with regards to equity, but it's also a bit dangerous because the countries that face the outbreaks have very limited visibility about the number of treatment courses that they can get in the coming weeks. So they have little visibility and they have little possibility to exactly know how to use these products. And let me show you an example. Under the current circumstances, healthcare providers in the field are tempted to ration a little bit the treatments that they have. For example, we've been advocating for many months now that these treatments should not only be used as curative treatments for confirmed cases, but they should also be used prophylactically for contacts of an Ebola case, and in order to prevent infection for people who have had a high-risk contact in the household, for example, while giving care to the patient. But because of the limited supply on the ground, this is not being done. Access is only for curative treatment when there is access. And Maria was reminding us that only a minority over the last years have had access to it. But unfortunately, high-risk contacts in the community couldn't have access over the last few years to these treatments as a prophylactic. And this is something that needs to change. And this is something that, in our opinion, is due to the fact that access is actually limited and there is a need to ration the drug.
Thank you so much, Julian. I hope the audience finds some similarity when we talk about medical practitioner has to think about rationing that they shouldn't be thinking about when you have less option in terms of access. And then the root cause is probably how the whole R&D story was unfolded, which we also included a timeline in the folder, which part of the report, elaborating why from 1976 till 21st century, nothing. And then suddenly we have something, but we still have challenges. So on that, I would want to go back to Armand. Maybe tell us a bit more. How would you think the missed opportunity, the biggest missed opportunity, that we could actually tell a different story? What should have been done differently? And what, if you're revisiting and also, sorry.
Right. I'm going to pick a missed opportunity, but probably a key one. A big opportunity was missed in the trial agreement for bomb. So, the National Institutes of Health and INRB are research institutions. They set up this trial agreement to carry out the trial, and bravo, mission accomplished. We got it. We have an evidence base that shows that these things work, and it is a big success. However, if that trial agreement had just a little bit more language in it, saying something to the tune of, and if the things that we're studying here are shown to work, they will be made available at an affordable price in sufficient quantities for the DRC for future Ebola outbreaks, or Central Africa, if we're going to be ambitious. If that had been assured as part of the trial agreement, we would not be here today. Somebody else would be here doing something. We missed an opportunity there, and we may get another one. All right. The treatments that have been approved, they work for Ebola virus disease. However, as the last year has reminded us, there are other filoviruses in the world beyond Ebola. And Ebola virus disease probably accounts for about half of the outbreaks. So we are underprepared. And fortunately, there are some investigational treatments out there and vaccines for the other filoviruses. There's even an antibody that covers all Ebola viruses. These are in earlier developmental stages, and at some point, some of these things will need clinical trials. And if there are future clinical trials, there will be future clinical trial agreements, and we will get another bite at the apple. Now, any individual African country may be in a difficult position to dig in its heels and demand that to host a trial that they be awarded some guarantee of future access. However, the collection of those African countries at risk, if they were to act together, are in a position where they could say, we, the at-risk countries, have determined that any future clinical trial that is going to happen will only do so if the trial agreement includes this language. I mean, collectively, they do have veto power, and they could extract that as a concession. So that would be a way to not have to do this all over again. And this is only one reason why these countries should organize, right? Filovirus outbreaks are small relative to the number of patients that you usually need to enroll for a trial. So it is likely that future trials will span multiple outbreaks in multiple countries. And you don't know where the next outbreak is going to be. So you need a common protocol. Everybody has to be using the same playbook. If you want 18 odd countries to agree on a protocol, you're going to need some sort of a transnational research consortium to organize that. So, and then you're going to need trial preparations, because in each one of these countries, you have to arrange for agreement on the protocol, ethical clearance from the National Review Board, importation authority for all of the investigational products, identification of local PIs, set up a trial infrastructure. There's a lot to do in any one country. And if you want to do that across 18 countries, you're going to need an organization that can do that. So there are a lot of good reasons to have such a transnational research consortium, but collective bargaining is one of them.
Okay, thanks a lot, Armand. So I hope the audience also hears something very familiar when it comes to governance. You know, who make decision, who pick priority, what is a true international collaboration may look like in a practical context when it comes to clinical trials, which is all on the table of negotiation now when it comes to PPR, and who decides, you know, the access conditions in R&D agreements. What kind of conditions should we put there? And how do we ensure that national stockpiling decision and practice will not interfere with the global needs, particularly countries who need them most, who should be around the table to decide on things. So on that, I mean, we try to reflect a little bit in our report, but still focus. So now I come back to Julian and quickly give us a kind of overview what we think, you know, action needs to be taken to first solve the Ebola, access crisis, and then to inform other broader issues.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there are lessons to be learned. I mean, from Ebola that may give perspective for other emerging infectious diseases, and basically, as Armand was saying, better mechanisms need to be discussed and established before epidemics happen. I think it's very important during inter-epidemics time, before epidemics rage out, because when the epidemics is there, it's difficult to negotiate things and to make the right decisions. And I think this is precisely the purpose of the negotiations that are happening today or these days around the pandemic treaty or PPR. But we need to remember that for many emerging infectious diseases, not just Ebola, but quite a few of them, we know that the regions who are most at risk of emergence are not North Africa. I've got trouble with the geography today. The regions most at risk are not North America or Europe. They are Southeast Asia and Africa for many of them. So it's really important to take into consideration, full consideration of the needs of these regions before designing the products that we will need. So we set just a few principles that I think should be part of the discussion that are happening today. So first of all, the profiles of the product should be adapted to some realistic use case scenarios in countries at highest risk. So we should keep in mind the potential use of these products in resource-limited settings like African countries. That's really important to keep that in mind. Secondly, the product should be affordable to all countries at risk, including resources-limited settings. And when intellectual property leads to prices that are unaffordable or too high for countries in need, then there should be some sort of a possibility to waive intellectual property rights to make sure that the final products can be affordable during the course of the epidemic. That's a very important principle that has been discussed during COVID, but not fully implemented. So I think it's important to discuss it again. In case of scarcity at global level, and we've seen that for COVID, we've seen that for quite a few products recently. In case of scarcity of products at global level, we should make clear that products should be distributed in priority to countries at highest risk, irrespective, regardless of their capacity to pay more. That's a very basic principle, but it seems to be difficult for some reason to implement it, but I think it's so basic that it should be driving the whole discussions. And finally, it could also make sense, at least for diseases like Ebola or Marburg or Lassa fever that only affect African countries. It would make sense to support the local manufacture in the medium term or longer term of these products, so that the continent can, that countries on the African continent can have the capacity to not only respond in the field, but also to produce therapeutics and vaccines that can be used to as part of the response. So these are the 4 principles that I would say if I was one of the negotiators of these discussions, which I'm not.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Yohanat. I think it's actually a good transition to for my invitation to Precious, because we understand Precious, you are performing a very important role now, leading a global process. And we also, I mean, many colleagues in this room, we know everybody wants to be part of that, because pandemic affects everybody. So Julian, you are part of this process because our discussion hopefully could contribute. So I would like to invite Precious to share your reflection, like how the story of Ebola that you are telling is probably one of many. And there's a lot of discussion here actually centralized on the issue of equity. How do you see that could potentially contribute and inform the broader process at a global level?
Well, first, I don't know if people can hear me at the back.
Yes.
We can. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Sorry, can I pause you for a minute? People on the Zoom are complaining about camera not working well. So if we can take a minute to just set that. Okay, just sorry, 30 seconds. Sorry.
Oh, I thought it was my voice.
People like to see you actually.
Oh, okay. I see.
Okay.
Is it okay?
We take the you can help.
Good. Thank you, Precious. Thank you.
Oh, okay. No, thank you for inviting me. It's opportune. But I also wanted to remind all of you that I also have sort of some direct and indirect contact with the Ebola processes. And I think it goes back to 2014, and I want to quote Else and others. At the time, what you said was that Ebola in West Africa was a wake-up call because of paying R&D. But prior to that, some of you in this room were advocates for R&D treaty. And I've been asking myself, what happened to all these advocates who spoke about R&D treaty? Because I haven't seen that language anywhere, and never been heard of it. But I just thought I needed to go back. But else I went back to your ways at the time, because I mean you're spot on when you say it was a wake-up call. But it means even with the wake-up call, we didn't wake up at all. Because in 2016, Sierra Leone was part of a trial, actually, which was called STRIVE. And in 2022, Uganda was part of a trial called Togomeza Ebola. But I just wanted to share the Ugandan experience because I was doing oversight work. And we went to Uganda, and Uganda was just about to start the trial. And one of the things they raised was that they were still trying to understand the protocol and the ethical dimension and so on, and WHO was supposed to provide training and so on. But there was no outbreak at the time in Uganda. The outbreak was in DRC. But I was just pleased that WHO was coordinating studies, not just for DRC, but they also included the surrounding countries, Rwanda, and Uganda and Rwanda. So what you said, and I was trying to respond to what you asked about a mechanism by which coordination should be established. And I wanted to highlight the issue that coordination should not just be in Geneva only. If you have a regional structure that can help with that coordination, that should happen. And perhaps we should rethink how the coordination happens. That, if you set up, global networks for multi-center trials, it's fine. But if they are regionally focused and they're in Africa, let's look at how capacity is built there and how we coordinate at that level. But I'm pleased that you raised, Ahmad, you raised a very important point, and I think one of the issues that I raised, in my past life as a director general, even prior to that, when I was the head of the regulatory agency, we included a clause, and I saw this as an ethical, consideration that you include a provision. We called it post-trial access. We had a wording that says when clinical trials are conducted, for all those people who are part of the trial, they should at least have access to the product when regulatory approval is conducted. At least in my country, we included that post-trial access provision. But I don't know whether it's something that's generalizable and whether you can, look at it as an ethical consideration or as a policy framework or as a INB treaty provision. But I think it's something with it because we're saying, people in our countries who take part in trials are poor. And I can share an experience of an anti-cancer therapy where people participated, and during that time they didn't have to pay a cent, but when the product was approved, they could not afford it. And we had to introduce measures for them to be given an exemption so that they could access those medicines. So I was just talking on general principles, but the question is, for purposes of an instrument like this, what kind of provision and what kind of weighting can you have to ensure that people can access the products that were the basis on which clinical trials were conducted and they were trial participants? And maybe it's a consideration for all of you to think about. But I wanted to deal with what you've just said, to say, at the time we've experienced Ebola, but what bothers me is that we've got cholera. It has been rearing its head. We have a vaccine that had to be rationed. At a height when Malawi had a terrible outbreak. So as I speak today, I read the headlines in my country. We've got outbreaks in Devon, we've got outbreaks of cholera. And I count a couple of provinces in South Africa where there's cholera outbreak. I'm not talking about an old disease. So perhaps else I want to go back to your ways to say this R&D infrastructure need to be changed. It cannot be that today, when we have a couple of vaccines of cholera, they are rationed. And we have now Ebola vaccines that are rationed. So it cannot be about rationing. There must be a much more sustainable system. And perhaps what we have in the pandemic accord, if it's inadequate, you better fix it now so that we can have a much more sustainable solution. So I'll pause there for now.
Thank you so much, Precious. It's really insightful and I think hope inspiring also for our later discussions. Yeah, I think we keep hearing rationing, the available treatment and vaccines. We keep hearing how do we show equity? Do we have enough tools? Are we waking up? But seems like we're not yet. But there's also another element is that patients in developing countries and developing countries themselves who probably don't have the same level of financial resources as the others, they are part of the research development, they're part of the innovation. Have they been recognized by rule and are they, what kind of mechanism and process we could relook at the infrastructure at a global level, try to empower those that hasn't been empowered to be part of the decision making. On that, I would like to invite Maria, because Sasana have been working extensively with developing countries and also on those issues and following the PBR discussion to share a bit your insight from working with Sasana, what kind of change you foresee the system can be redressed towards the meaningful equity in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Yuan, and I hope Mike up there can hear me. So, I think one of the important takeaways from the report is that the findings that you bring out in the context of the lack of access to these two drugs can be extrapolated into many other contexts. We already heard from Armand about the fact that we are underprepared for this particular type of virus, filovirus, right? But it would be similar for other contexts as well. And therefore, what you actually point out in the conclusion in the executive summary that you have shared, in terms of what needs to be addressed in the negotiations on pandemic preparedness and response. And we have two parallel processes going on, the INB negotiations, which you're aware of, and also the IHR negotiations. These need to be addressed in both these contexts. Both are, by the way, treaty instruments under different constitutional anchors of the WHO, but both are binding treaties as such. And therefore, it needs to be ensured that we have complementarity between the two instruments, and we ensure that equity, broadly speaking, remains at the core of these two instruments. And all of these elements that you mentioned should be part of that process. In particular, I think one of the important sort of things that we need to draw from this report, for example, is that there was this mention, the fact that patients have contributed to in-kind sharing of samples. Now, in this report, there is a mention of the fact that the Regeneron drug in particular was developed by accessing the sequence information, which was accessed from a US open access database, where it was put by a European research institution, which actually had secured the sample from a patient in Guinea. Now the drug was developed out of that sequence information, and what we have today is that it is stockpiled in the north, and the south is left to fend for crumbs, literally. Now, given this context, this actually shows the fact that when it came to developing the drug, accessing the sample and sequence information, Nagoya Protocol or the CBD did not become an impediment. But we do not have access to the final product. And therefore, it is important that one of the critical asks of developing countries in these negotiations currently is that there should be a pathogen access and benefit sharing system, a comprehensive system, and an effective system, which ensures that access to the samples, sequence information, and the products that are developed out of these, the technologies that are developed out of those, remain on an equal footing or addressed on an equal footing. And I think that would be the critical issues to address in these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Namalia. Yeah, it's very, very striking example that we documented in the report. And just to add that, it is also intellectual property issue because for the moment, two companies still hold IP rights. One originally holds its own patent on the therapeutics, despite of the developing the drug out of the access into patient sample, and then Ridgeback got the kind of exclusivity from licensing in the patent rights from the US government. But without further ado, I would like to invite Ambassador Anne-Marie from France, who serves as a global health ambassador, so to give us the first intervention and we open the discussion. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make some comments. And your colleagues. The difficulties in accessing treatment, especially for Ebola, were and are a prime example of the need to challenge and improve the health architecture to ensure access to medicine for those who need them most. And actually, in global health, I started with Ebola crisis. I was in Guinea in 2014 and 2015. And I worked with MSF, and I would like first to thank you for what you have done, and thank you for your words. But looking beyond Ebola, the COVID-19 crisis has again highlighted the vulnerability of our global systems and forced us to refocus on what's important: countries' ownership and priorities. And the crisis has highlighted and strengthened partnerships at all levels: national, regional, international, around common values such as equitable access, solidarity, the fight against inequalities. But we need concrete actions with concrete impact on the ground. That means working with all the actors on the ground, including governments, international organizations, social society, communities, and the private sector. But the tensions in the supply chains of health products have highlighted the importance for the whole world, especially in the African countries, of developing regional capacity. And you mentioned it. For production of medical equipment, medical countermeasures, especially vaccines. In this perspective, France is committing to the ongoing negotiation of the pandemic agreement, and I would like to it's nice, precious for your leadership as CNA. Thank you very much. And I think Julien, you should be involved in the process because your proposals were very good. And France is fully committed also to strengthening regional production capacity. And I would like to give just 2 examples. The first one is in South Africa. France is the leading contributor to WHO and RNA technology transfer program through the contribution of 70 million euros to the medicine patent pool. And the transfer of technology and know-how, which is voluntary. But it is essential to meet the needs of partners, especially the African partners, in terms of health sovereignty and equal access to health products. Meanwhile, France is committed to continuing efforts to stimulate and coordinate public-private partnerships especially by encouraging first the French private sector, but not only the French one, to take an active role in this initiative, either in training, in production, in developing innovative healthcare solutions adapt to local needs. And we must also encourage private investment and promote the growth of suitable ecosystems in order to achieve regional health. But there is a but. These efforts only make sense if these production capacities find the market. And actually, we need shaping market, especially a vaccine market, and in Africa, to ensure new production chains turn into healthy and sustainable vaccine markets. So all these examples show that by working together at the right level, adapting the different contexts and involving our partners, especially the African partners, in the development of regional and local initiatives, will achieve equitable access to treatment for all, alongside a new pandemic agreement.
Thank you, Ambassador. So thank you very much for all of the speakers. Now we would open the floor. I think there's story being told. Many ongoing access challenges are around us, as we're discussing the pandemic preparedness response. So now I would like to open the floor. I know there's quite a number of colleagues among us who have very rich experience working on those issues, being it access benefit sharing mechanism, access conditions in R&D, and licensing and transparency, particularly related to reachback, and also we have also else who actually published a paper about Ebola access. So I'd like to invite them and also the broader audience to raise your questions and comments, and then disagree also with the speakers if you feel like they missed anything like important. So maybe I would like to invite Els, because she just recently published a paper based on also the work on Ebola treatment too. Yeah.
Just from here? No, that's fine. Yeah, so thanks so much for the opportunity, and happy that this report is coming out, and thank you, Precious, for remembering the wake-up call, because that was 2014, and indeed we are 10 years later almost. A few additions I would like to bring, and Armand, you mentioned the need for agreements, and I was the director of the MSF Access Campaign when we negotiated, not the agreement, because actually there was no trial agreement for the Palm trial. And basically, I mean, we were always asking, like, what is the commitment from everybody to ensure equitable, affordable access at the end? And of course, we're in an emergency and everybody was rushing. We need to get this trial started because every day we lose and this and that. And there was basically, everybody was saying, like, of course, we all want equitable, affordable access. But we don't have time to go into the legal agreement and negotiations. And so we all went on good faith that it would go well. And then we see 4 or 5 years later. And so my message of that is we need binding, enforceable agreements. And I mean, I saw the recent, the new draft of the INB, and there is a lot of language that is like as appropriate, and all kinds of language that sounds like, well, if you like to, you can do it, but you don't have to. This will never work. And I think that we need to have the courage to go for binding, enforceable agreements. And there, we know that the private sector has been extremely reluctant in that. And there, we as public health community have been reluctant to push, because we are very happy if they want to work with us and make available their candidate treatments or vaccines to be trialed. And there is this kind of empower, or an unhealthy power balance, an unhealthy power imbalance, and where we need, I think, norms, preset norms and agreements that you don't need to negotiate it anymore. That it's clear that if there needs to be post-trial access, not only for the participants of the trials, actually for the communities, and we need to clarify how we are going to do that collectively, I don't think we can expect the companies to be responsible for that. If R&D is a collective effort, I think ensuring equitable access, it needs to be built in from the start, end to end, and we're all collectively responsible and accountable for that. And for me, that type of language needs to be kind of really built in. And then maybe one additional comment. I think that we also, and I hear you, that we need to involve the private sector. I think that's really essential. But we need to get the governance right. And we cannot only work on the terms of the private sector and where market forces basically drive their priorities, which is normal because they're the private sector. But we are sitting in a situation of market failures, and we cannot solve market failures just by markets. We need a health and a health rights-based approach as well, and where we need to find the way to responsibilize governments to work with private sector, but towards the common goal of equitable access to the right innovation and including of old medications where the market fails to make them available. We shouldn't rely on them on the market.
Okay, thank you, Els. I think we already have in a real discussion. So I would like to actually invite Michelle Chan, who's the Director of Policy, Head of Policy Advocacy from Drug and Neglected Disease Initiative to share, because DNDi has been working very extensively on getting the R&D governance right, also from your own experience as an organization. So I'd like to invite you to give
Thank you.
introduction. Yeah.
And thank you for this both good and terrible example. I think that what we have seen, I think, with Ebola and with COVID is a kind of triumph of science, but the failure of access. And I think what we've also seen is that the policy making has not really corrected that failure of access. And I think from our perspective as an organisation that works on R&D for infectious diseases, we've seen, and I think Alma was saying this, that there is a chain of activities and processes, and at each stage of that chain, there are policies that could be put in place that could change the outcomes. So Els has talked about conditions on clinical trials, but there are conditions that could be put throughout the process from early stage research. The question is, who has the power to do that? And I think one of the things that you brought out quite clearly here was that there was quite a lot of public money, and we know that there is going to be public money in particularly pandemic preparedness and response, so that governments have an ability to leverage that funding, to put conditions on that funding, to ensure the sharing of knowledge. And that includes the possibility of transferring technology if you have artificial scarcity, and you can sort of build that up. And so I would encourage that when you're looking at the pandemic accord in the IHR, that you do have an express condition in there that says that if you're using public money, you will put conditions on. I think the other thing that I want to say is that chain is not just about the R&D elements, as you talked about it. It is about what is the enabling environment for governance of R&D. It is very clear that R&D is not just in the north, but that what is only measured often is the commercial effect of that. And we have seen that in clinical trials, you need to take those clinical trials and the research in different countries. And so therefore you need to have collaboration. And I think that is a very good case for why we need collaboration in an accord, because no country can carry out research and development on their own. And then the last thing is the common vision. This wasn't just driven by commercial concerns, it was driven by biosecurity concerns. And I think we need to move to human security as the driver here, and look at ways in which we can create governance that includes all of the countries, but is focused on that common outcome.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Now, sorry for inviting more speakers because we fully open the floor. I would like to invite Sangeeta from Third West Network, who is a senior legal advisor. TWA has been working extensively also on the issues of access, including access beneficiaries. So I would like to invite Sangeeta to give us some reflection.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for sharing this story. I think this is a very, very important story to be told. But I think this is not a new story. We have seen this recur several times now. H5N1 in 2005, vaccines were developed with strains actually shared by Southeast Asian countries, but when they wanted access, it was all taken up by US and a lot of other developed countries through advanced purchase agreements, and they could not get access. Then we had COVID-19. At the peak of the pandemic, actually in 2020, UN did a survey, and they said that high-income countries had $10 for every per person had $10 of medical supplies, access to $10 of medical supplies, whereas middle-income countries had $1 and the lowest had 10 cents of medical supplies. So clearly, when there is going to be a higher demand compared to supply, those that have the financial resources are going to have access. And many of this, in the case of Ebola, they have signed into advanced purchase agreements. I think you share this very important story, but we have seen this happen with flu vaccines as well. Publicly funded, huge government subsidies, but when it comes to access, only some countries have access. So how do we resolve this? I think a very serious conversation needs to be had. We do need obligations in these negotiations through the amendment of IHR, but also the new instrument, the treaty, or whatever the instrument is, obligations on states, right? But I think we need to go further. Obligations on states are not sufficient, because when we say, we call on states, if you call on the US or other developed countries and say, look, can you ask manufacturers to share? They'll say, no, we cannot impose any conditions on manufacturers. I think that's the response you get. And so we also need to have commitments, legally binding commitments on manufacturers during a PHEIC and a pandemic. What role they're going to play, who they're going to supply, how much they're going to supply, and there has to be certainty. And here I want to just point out, there is a 10-year precedent in the context of the pandemic influenza preparedness framework that actually came out because Indonesia could not get supply in 2005 during H5N1. And there are conditions placed on manufacturers to give monetary contributions, which is then used to build capacity for preparedness, which I understood was very important when it came to COVID-19 response, surveillance, capacity building, and all of that. But also WHO has secured about 400 million doses to be provided in real time during a flu pandemic. Now, we have not seen a flu pandemic, but I think this in itself is not sufficient. We need to go further, because now we know we need licenses, because globally manufacturing is very concentrated. I think that is the conclusion of all the different reports that have come out. It's too concentrated, right? So we need to have licenses going out to developing country manufacturers. We need to have designated production sites. And these manufacturers have to be committed to give licenses. We need technical know-how, we need technology, and we need the doses, and we need monetary contribution. So I think there has to be commitments, legally binding, put on manufacturers. And I think this whole access and benefit sharing is a very important tool to operationalize equity. Just final thing is that this has to be specific. I think one of the challenges in this negotiation is all very general and vague. It has to be specific, it has to be detailed. So if we talk of benefit sharing, it should not be something that is resolved in the future or parked in some committee to be sorted out through some guidelines, because that doesn't give us certainty. For us to have certainty, it has to be detailed, it has to be specific. And if we end all these different negotiations with something very vague, optional, voluntary, I think we have not really achieved what we set out to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta. The last guest I would like to invite is Geneva, who is the director of Knowledge Economy International. So many of us know that TI and himself have been following those processes very extensively, also on the issue of licensing transparency, including related to Ebola therapeutics. So I would like to invite Jim to share some reflection. And a story also.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think one thing that I talked to MSF about was really Ebola. Was that there's a company, Ridgeback, in the United States and in Miami that got a contract with the U.S. government to manufacture be involved in commercialization of treatment for Ebola. And The product was developed by the NIH and clinical trials by MSF and the NIH and other, I think, European funders to test the product out. The NIH knew how to manufacture it. And Ridgeback was the CEO, her husband was like a hedge fund manager in the United States. Hadn't done any of that stuff. And so they got a grant from the Trump administration to make the product. And then they didn't have the patent. The patent was held by the U.S. government. Initially, they had like a non-exclusive license, and then they got the at one point for free. They got the exclusive rights to use the trial data that MSF and the NIH and other parties were involved in, and that gave them a $100 million priority review voucher for registering the Ebola drug with the NIH, on top of the grant that they'd already had. And they paid, from what the NIH told me, they paid nothing for the rights to get the exclusive rights to the trial data, which would give them a monopoly on an FDA approved version, because it would be hard to register a product without those data rights for depending on the country, at least 5 years. And then a generic version. And then after the product was registered, the non-exclusive patent license was turned into, there was put a notice to turn it into an exclusive license. So it was kind of a weird situation where a company in Miami, not far from Mar-a-Lago, actually, a woman was appointed by President Trump to some advisory board, ends up with this exclusive rights on this Ebola treatment that they didn't invent, didn't do the trials, didn't do anything. Everything was paid for all over. It's been very profitable. They also, same company that got the license from Emory for this COVID-19 therapy, which they then turned around and relicensed to Merck. They're getting half the profits from Molnupiravir. And they also very minuscule role in the development of that product as well. So that's an example of how awesome public health emergencies can be for some parties. And I think that explains in part why problem support people are real big profit opportunities for a lot of companies. So that makes the negotiations on something like a pandemic treaty challenging, because these people are politically active, and really there's a lot more people involved than just that, of course. And one of the original ideas, Precious mentioned the R&D treaty, was, right now people are complaining a lot about the TRIPS agreement and, all these sort of agreements that require you to have temporary monopolies or patents and things like that on data rights and things on drugs and vaccines, because it leads to inequality and excessive pricing and things like that. And that's really the primary international mechanism for paying for the private sector end of R&D. Is, the companies come in at risk in theory, and that the reward for being successful is this temporary monopoly. So our feeling has been that to replace the temporary monopoly, you have to replace it with something that goes to what deals with the risk-bearing thing that the companies do. And there are different ways you can do it, but there's an internationalization of the whole patent regime. It doesn't exist for these other things. And so the idea of the R&D treaty was, if you could make the international obligation about, by hook or by crook, subsidizing, funding, rewarding, incentivizing drug development, it shouldn't matter what mechanism you use. You could use patent monopolies, but you could use big market entry rewards, you could use grants, you could use contracts, tax credits, or whatever. You had to sort of add up the right amount. And the idea is that if you did those things, then you would have lower obligations on the IPR front. In other words, to make the IP like a choice to fund R&D, not a mandate to fund R&D. And at the national level in the US, certainly for infectious diseases, the public sector role is really big, but there's no international obligation on doing that. So for this to work, people would have to agree to some obligations outside of the patent system to fund R&D to get an agreement to lower the IP requirements. And so one of the problems is there's one group of people that like lowering the IP requirements, but don't like adding any new obligations to replace it. And other people are just, lobbied by the drug companies. They like the old regime. So that's, I think, a challenge in this negotiation. As I think Els mentioned, and Michelle, there's very weak obligations on what you have to do on the funding side and things like that. If they were more concrete, then you have to have a stronger argument that you didn't need to have the strong IP provisions if you have a substitute for them somewhere in the agreement that has some real meaningful and binding type provisions on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jenny, for sharing your views. So now we'd like to open the floor and see if any audience would like to share your observation, questions, and comments from the.
Hi everyone. So Anaïs Legrand, nice to meet you. I work for WHO Viral Hemorrhagic Fevers. I fully align with all what has been said about improving, I would say, research and development, access and equity. I just want to come back to Ebola and current situations that we have for Ebola virus disease, and maybe to bring a little bit of complement to where we stand. And we are all in agreement. The situation is far from being optimal. We have 2 treatments that demonstrated they could improve chance of survival for this disease. I'm not totally in agreement with the figure you put in terms of number of people who accessed during the 5 last outbreak. I'm pretty sure you included some patients who were dead at time of detection. So, but anyway, it's not optimal. So just on WHO side, and I would like, because it has not been quoted yet, to mention the International Coordinating Group on Vaccine Provision. Maybe most of you know, but maybe you're not aware of it. It's a stockpile mechanism for vaccines that has been established back in 1998, if I'm correct, with meningitis, and then has been extended to yellow fever vaccines, and then cholera vaccine, and more recently for the Ervebo licensed vaccine against Ebola virus disease. As part of the discussion around the stockpile, and again, this doesn't solve the importance of countries to get access to the treatment, but at an interim solution, as it has been done for yellow fever vaccine, and we all agree that it's still strange to have an emergency stockpile vaccine for yellow fever, right? But that's another discussion. The discussion were to include as well the treatment for Ebola virus vaccine. This group is composed of MSF, UNICEF, the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, and WHO, and the allocation is given if there is a confirmed outbreak, which generally is the case, to what is needed. We are in discussion with Regeneron, of course, to get access, and we are in discussion with them to get a donation of the licensed product. We do not want investigational doses. Obviously, we want the licensed product. So we've been in strong discussion for a while, and I definitely agree with you. It takes too long, and lucky for us, we haven't had that many BD outbreak lately. But also, and it was mentioned, I think, there is also the push to get this product, these 2 products, but unlikely Reachback will submit it, being pre-qualified through the WHO pre-qualification team. And why do we want that? Because we want to then, when it's pre-qualified, go back to the country and make sure that they go through the regulation process for them to be also able to import the product when they need it. It seems like an easy step. I just can tell you that for the Ervebo licensed vaccine, we are still working with at-risk countries that still have not licensed the product in their country, although they are at risk. So it's also a step that we shouldn't minimize. Of course, we arrive at the end of the chain, I would say, and many more steps need to be done before. But just to mention that piece of work, and yeah. And I will stop there. I have plenty of other comments.
Thank you very much for the additional information, and then the steps that has been taken, which again reflected how challenging we are. It is when we are talking about the future pandemic, one of our view in MSF is that we shouldn't forget there's pandemic likely and there's an existing pathogen with pandemic potential and access challenge hasn't been solved, such as Ebola. So I'm like, yeah, okay, so the gentleman on the back, and then we come to you. Yeah, please introduce yourself for the usual.
Hi, I'm Amitabh Global Center, Geneva Graduate Institute. Am I audible now?
More.
Okay.
Shout.
I just have a small observation since the R&D treaty is coming up again. It's just really great. In the advent of IND negotiation and this particular Ebola case study is very, very enchanting. So congratulations to all. R&D treaty actually last the assembly, it was discussed in 2012 by the Council for Empowered Working, and 2013 onwards it was put out of agenda actually. And that was the last negotiation, and in fact it was replaced by the demonstration project. Interestingly, WHO on its own actually, Article 19, so it can invoke a treaty for that, and it happened in the past, like in the case of tobacco control. So this is just thought to make. And one question is that it is R&D treaty, as per the report also, the summary findings, that limited to financing and access to information, or should it also include the research capacity strengthening in that broader framework? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Nago Hassanin. I work for UNICEF Supply Division. I'm posted here, and thank you very much, Anaïs, because I wanted to complement the work that you mentioned, because we were part of the ICG mechanism establishment, and we found, just to share with you one of the sources, that unless we pay for these therapeutics, we're not going to sustain. So if we're still maintaining as donations, this would be something that will be very difficult for two reasons. First, to maintain, second, to replenish when we use it. So maybe the paper can call for funding for the stockpile. Would be great. Gavi paid for the initial seed fund for that, so maybe we have. And my second naive question is, there is an international alliance for vaccines, there is an international alliance for diagnostic in the making, but there is no international alliance for therapeutics, which is very important to have. And my last thought is that unless we couple diagnostics with the therapeutics, I think we're not going to cover that. And especially some of these therapeutics are being used outside of the main intended use as repurposed for other diseases. And the use of test and treat is actually, because those patients are not released unless they are tested. And this is how we drug monitor the use of our drug. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the further observation. So I think if there's no additional hands. Yeah, Monica? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I'm Monica, I work with MSF in the city. Thank you. I think in these meetings, I have the feeling that we are preaching to the converted, because that's why we are here. So we all have identified the problem, and we all try to find solutions within the existing system. I would like to be thinking a little bit out of the box. How can we challenge the system and finding the cracks to make them wider, and then trying to get a way through? Because my feeling is we are asking for officialization, legal work, but in a way, it's a little bit like the people that is making this not happening is not in this room. So the echoing is a little bit limited. Can we find, or anyone had an idea, or maybe for the future, to find where are the cracks of the system that we can exploit, and where can we totally disruptive of the system that we can actually go back and by destabilizing, passing things through.
Great question.
So it's a strategy.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so my name is Tuada Ibrahimo. I'm from the Medicines Patent Pool. Talking about solution. So I just wanted to share. I'm sure many of you here, you are aware about the case of enzalutamide, which is the drug for prostate cancer, which was funded by NIH, and a generic in India tried to produce the generic version of it. A lower court blocked that. Actually approved it, allowed it to go when the patent was challenged. And so a higher court blocked that process. And that led to an outcry, I think, by a group of students that go under the name of University Allied for Essential Medicines. So that eventually led to a collaboration between MPP, UACL, UCLA, and that group to develop a language around access to be inserted in R&D funding agreements. So this is, I mean, as somebody said, this is not new. This is a process, or this is a discussion that has been going on. I guess the question is, from having the language developed, how can we actually get to have maybe a kind of system where we have a template, maybe a pre-agreed template, license template for that can be adapted as needed during peacetime to make access possible. How can that be the norm? How do we go around, for example, the ongoing negotiation? How can we have a kind of system where from that stage of agreeing to fund R&D, those necessary provisions are there, and those provisions actually translate to products? Because you could have language inserted, and there may be gaps in know-how. So it's important that we think around how to get this done. But just to mention that there is language existing, but the thing is, how do we get to the theory how do we move from theory to practice?
Thank you so much. So if there are no other hands in the room, I would like to come back to our panelists. So in responding to some of the comments, and also the very kind of provocative question from Monica: how can we crack the system, and how can we think out of the box? Some of the experiences shared by all of the commentators, and some of the practical experiences. Okay, we can try to prop a little bit, do things differently. What is goodwill?
Can I be a bit provocative?
Please.
We've got a couple of people sitting in this room who, when we started these discussions on access, it was at that time, we did not have access to antiretrovirals, and many people were dying. And I'll just cite a few examples. Some people in this room introduced the concept of medicine patent and told us about some aeroplane parts and and at the time it was a dream. I didn't even think it would happen. I'm just saying that certain ideas evolved and there was implementation thereafter. So I'm saying that because this is a once in a lifetime opportunity where we have 3 processes that are converging: the IHR amendment, the pandemic accord, and the high-level declaration. And I'm hoping that we can have from member states. I'm looking at member states, language that can be transformed nationally in a way that it can help us move this agenda forward. I'm saying that because from when we had the global strategy and plan of action, there was a high-level panel that was established by Ban Ki-moon, and again, we're meeting and we're having all these processes. So for some of the things that were shared, what Sangeeta said, what you said else, and Michelle and Jay, you said this before, but this is obviously a different era, and it's opportune. We have something to work from and to work with, and I'm quite hopeful. And in conclusion, I just wanted to repeat what I said earlier when I addressed the meeting, to say, member states are such interesting people. I love them. Because we started with a 38-page document we ended up with 208. Actually, it changed from 38 to 194, and latest was 208. Now to collapse all of that and make sense of it and make it 43. I'm making an open appeal and request, because I've said it already, that it would be so good, because those 208 kind of pages had attribution, and we respect member states. We don't want them exposed in that way. But the Bureau's text has no attribution. So can it be made available? And then can we have this conversation and hear from all of you in that open and transparent way, so that it's inclusive and we can move towards, a common goal of making the world safer and better.
Thank you so much, Precious. Thank you. So any other comments from panelists?
Maybe a big comment, but yeah, thank you, Annalise, for bringing the more accurate information. Yes, it's good to see that, and it's important to know that the price that is charged for Regeneron's drug for Ebola in the US, we believe that the US has paid around $7,000 per treatment course. So that's what I meant when I said you need to design drugs that are going to be affordable at the end. If you design a drug and you know it already that is going to cost $7,000 per treatment course, and that drug is supposed to be used against Ebola, I mean, the target product profile was wrong in the beginning. That's the price. So at this price, I suspect that only the nation is possible. I don't know what is money available for WHO, but I suspect that $7,000 for treatment course is going to be very difficult to buy more than a dozen. But you need to know, and this is in a report, that the actual manufacturing costs are probably 5 times higher. So that's also important to. But what we need to call in that respect is more transparency on manufacturing costs, on R&D costs, so that the price that's paid at the end of the day is fair, particularly for diseases like that. I mean, if you want to make a lot of money for disease for high-income countries, that's one thing. But when you target Ebola, you have a duty to pay the right price, right? So in the report, we show that there's a big discrepancy between what it actually costs to Regeneron to develop and manufacture the drug, and the price that has been charged, as far as we know, because there's limited transparency, to the US government and to the other treatment providers. So transparency is a very important issue to incorporate as well in any global efforts to develop new drugs for emerging infectious disease.
Thank you very much, Julia. Very important point. Also, I think that this issue is also around the negotiation table. What level of obligation that can be agreed upon, so that we wouldn't work in a dark box. Basically, civil society, I think many among us have tried also, but without much success. So that's important as well. So, any other reflection from the panelists?
I was just reflecting from starting when I opened, and I asked, judge for yourselves, and then I'm trying to put together all the different events that I've been at, et cetera, and the word disruptive came to mind, which was my co-panelist at the DNDI event was saying. But I think what I'm looking at how to frame all this, and what I always think is it requires thinking without borders. Of course, I'm going to use that. Doctors Without Borders, but it's also this radical way of approaching now, of collaborating amongst the people, which is us, and how do we make this an inclusive approach and remind the decision makers they are people like us, and that we each have an ethical obligation to each other, and it's maybe just reminding that again and again and again. And even if one of us can slip through that little slit door or whatever, it's that collective that's going to open that one. And I think it's great to see everybody here together. But we need to join the voices and push those doors apart.
Thank you, Maria. So
really, when you think of the solutions, NIH,
my tax dollars support the making of all of these drugs. There needs to be a change through the political will of those in charge to stipulate, if you're using tax dollars to develop a drug, then so be it, part will go to the distribution. I mean, it's not rocket science. So how do you do that? Do you do that through activism? Do we have the connections to get into the right areas? And I would think MSF would have those types of connections, but it's not only the NIH, it's the European Union. I mean, there are a lot of entities that need to be targeted, and possibly through activism, and especially now is the time to do it. If we don't do it now, a year from now, everything gets swept under the carpet, and we continue having the same discussions over and over and over again. So, like we were talking about 2015 else, it's like we're kind of in the same boat. Anyway, my frustration.
Thank you very much. So before we close it, we have actually a question online from the audience. We need Amount or Maria to have. So I remind my colleague Jasmine to read out.
It's a pretty basic question about Ebola. It's more like how long after exposure do the symptoms occur is one question. And one question is, how is Ebola actually diagnosed?
So the textbook answer is 2 to 21 days, the incubation period. In practice, peak incubation is probably 5 to 7. How is it diagnosed? It should be, and almost always is, by a polymerase chain reaction. It's a blood test. If nothing else, the COVID-19 outbreak made everybody familiar with what PCR is. And even people have never said CT value before, so you know kind of what the quantification of it is. So that's the short answer. There are some longer things, but that's enough.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we have one more hand from the floor. Yeah.
Sorry, I just was reflecting on everything that was said. I think a lot of interesting comments. I think the reality is the power is with manufacturers and a lot of the developed country governments that are not wanting to share, whether it's technology, although it's all publicly funded and all. And so I think no one strategy is going to work to deliver equity that we require. Because, this is a very, the situation in Ebola might be different it's going to be different from COVID, and the next pathogen might be different. So I think we need to have multiple strategies. So one is attaching conditions to publicly funded research. Access and benefit sharing is another very important strategy. We will need to, there's the issue of attaching conditions when you do clinical trials. So I think it is multiple approaches and strategies that will be required, and not to put all our eggs into one strategy, hoping that will deliver. Because I think the way the world is in the current state and who holds the power, it will require multiple strategies at different levels, international but also regional, because some of it can be done through collective actions in the region, as was mentioned. So I just wanted to make that point very clear. Yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah.
Thank you, Sangita.
Can I add one thing to all the things that you just said? Because I think that ultimately what we need is also equity in the capability to innovate and to drive the research and development, because too many of the conversations today are about manufacturing capacity, as if we can actually live with the current R&D system and it will deliver. But no, in real equity will actually only be possible if we really invest in local capacity and access to the technology and the know-how and the knowledge, etc., in the inter-pandemic or whatever periods, because it's not once there is an epidemic that we can act. We need to build that and level the playing field, that we don't have only innovations in the global north. And for me, that's the long-term solution. But it needs to be built in anything what we do today to get there, maybe. And the mRNA hub is one example as a starting, but it's a pilot. I mean, we need many more of those, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. So that might lead us to eventually disrupt the system and then have some better future. So so before we close, I would like to invite all those speakers the panelists to give one sentence, your thought, what you have to do in the future, and then so we'll start with Maria.
Oh goodness, I'll just use what I already wrote. Medicine shouldn't be a luxury. It is a global phenomenon.
Thank you.
Well, I was going to say I'm an optimist. I still see the glass as half full.
Good.
That can still be filled. So we have an opportunity, and this is an opportune moment.
Thank you. Okay, so maybe I invite Lady first.
I thought I was last. No, just one word. We need everybody.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And we're back to Alma.
Sure. I'm gonna be a bit awkward here. Having been in and out of scientific meetings around Ebola and talking about these, it's a lot of white people. You know, I mean, and they're all good. I mean, these are great researchers that are really committed to their job. They've done a lot of great work. You know, the companies that are producing stuff, at least the scientific people from marketing division, really great people. And then you like look around and you're like, well, what are the flaming Africans here? Because you know the final mile goes through there, and and this is sort of. I don't know, we got to make a step somewhere forward there. I mean, a lot of well-intentioned people in North America are not going to solve the problem all the way through to Africa. So, you know, I hope that changes.
Great. Thank you. Julian.
It was raised by my colleague here, talking about emerging infectious disease, pandemic threats, and, you know, future pandemics. There's a lot of cholera these days. There's a lot of, you know, very basic needs that are not met. I'm a bit scared that these efforts in favor of future pandemic threats may be at the expense of more immediate needs. So let's make it clear that everything that is going to be done is going to be additional. I work on neglected diseases, and many of them, and they're going to fall further into neglect because so much money is being put. I'm sorry to say that, right? But so much money is being put for, you know, new tools against future threats. Okay, fair enough, but not at the expense of existing needs.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I think what we really need is equity, not as charity, but equity as a legal obligation with binding responsibilities on the parties.
Thank you so much. It's very powerful. So I want to end our event by again directing everyone to the report. Especially I want to tell the story that we featured in the cover, and my colleague sent me the story. The story features Ebola viral disease survivor puts her hands on a survivor's oar that's erected by MSF at its Ebola Management Center in Liberia. And contributions by patients, survivors, and their communities were crucial to the R&D of treatment for Ebola viral diseases. So we hope this will be remembered by everybody who will read our report. What we're discussing here in the high-level political panels in Geneva matters to every single survivors from different diseases. And also thank for my colleague in MSF and one of the authors for the report online is Eileen. So she's a female doctor still working with the communities within MSF medical team. She couldn't join us, but I want to thank her. She was online. Thank you very much for coming, and then hope we keep in touch.